Hi, my name is Susanna Gallor, and I am a lecturer at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Today, I'm going to be talking a little bit about how we might apply social justice principles and strategies to help us teach more equitably in psychology. Before I jump right in with some ideas and principles, it's important to understand the context of why it's important to talk about this and to consider different teaching practices and pedagogy. We live in an increasingly diverse global society, and it's been very well documented that across the country, we have an increasingly diverse student body in higher education. And so I believe, and many scholars have discussed and shown, that people cannot be understood independently from their social contexts. And psychology as a discipline cannot be learned without the examination of knowledge within a historical, political, cultural, and social context. So we're trying to move away from psychology's traditional focus on the individual, but in a different way from sociology's focus. So what is a social justice approach to teaching? Having a social justice approach is more than just a set of instructional techniques. It should be a philosophy, or it could be a philosophy, a way of looking at our society and the world, and do this from a psychological perspective. By adopting a social justice approach, the field of psychology can become a more inclusive discipline. And so here are some principles from social justice education that we can apply in the teaching of psychology. So first and foremost, many would say to create a classroom climate that emphasizes participative and interactive learning. There should be active participation in the learning process. Some have said or written how students themselves can co-create the course from the content and what is taught to how it is taught and evaluated. We should try to integrate critical inquiry and systems perspectives. We're going to get into some examples in a few minutes just to see how this might look in practice. But again, here are just some general principles. We would try to have a focus on historically marginalized and oppressed groups, while also integrating dominant and majority group perspectives. I'm not suggesting that we not continue teaching a lot of what we have been teaching for decades. But we do know that historically, a lot of voices and perspectives have been ignored, if not minimized, in the teaching of different areas in psychology. So we want to integrate that more. We want to emphasize intersectionality. And related to that, recognize the social construction of identities. We should focus on how social structures matter and not just focus on intrapsychic factors. And everyone is made up of many different social identities and backgrounds, and they interact with each other. And so we want to, at the very least, acknowledge that, that context in each of our lives. So let's just jump right into ideas for application. And again, we don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to kind of move through these quickly. I usually like to ask folks to tell me some of their own ideas as I present information, or some sort of structures and frameworks to consider for your own classes. But we'll get to some examples as well in a few minutes of these more general ideas that I'm going to talk about. First is the incorporation of service learning in undergraduate courses, specifically psychology courses. There are some courses that are only service learning courses, and we can take some lessons from those courses and that kind of experience. So what is service learning? It's experiential education in which learning is enhanced through volunteer work and reflection. And so from a social justice perspective, students volunteer with underserved or marginalized populations specifically and connect their site experiences to their coursework. So students engage in individual and group service learning experiences or projects that we know from research will help reduce stereotypes, will facilitate cultural and racial understanding, will enhance civic responsibility, and connect students more personally to what they're learning in their courses. So service learning offers students opportunities to apply newly acquired information outside of classroom settings. And meta-analyses and research studies have investigated the efficacy of service learning courses, but also incorporating service learning experiences and projects in courses, and found that students involved in service learning in coursework gain significant knowledge regarding the academic content. So there's something about that, being able to apply the content in a very real world way that can help reinforce some of those concepts that you're teaching. And I know it may be hard to think about what this could look like in certain topics or areas of psychology. And I tried to, integrate a few examples of what it could look like a little bit later. So we'll get to that. Here, I also wanted to focus on the actual curriculum and the importance of intentionally integrating diverse perspectives and inclusive curricula as you're planning that. There's no value neutral course content or classroom practice. And so it's important to set that climate and that tone from the start, and to have that woven through not only what how you teach, but also what you teach. So you want to help students see themselves in relation not only to themselves and their immediate relationships and contexts, but also to broader sociocultural and contextual influences. So make course content inclusive by incorporating certainly more traditional textbooks and sources that you would typically find in different psychology classes, but look outside of the discipline and try to incorporate materials that address a diversity of perspectives, worldviews, and research findings. Seek out new connections that relate course topics to issues of social importance and inequalities, especially in current events. Utilize multiple methods of assessment and evaluation of student performance to promote equity in the classroom. And then finally, try to integrate the perspectives of those whose experiences have been marginalized or ignored. And I mentioned this a couple of minutes ago, really in all areas of psychology. I think this is something that has been very effectively done in very specific topical areas of psychology, like multicultural psychology, social psychology. But really, we can do this across a lot of different areas of psychology. So, for example, let's think about developmental psychology. One question you could ask and explore in a developmental psych class could be, how does a lack of safe neighborhoods affect children's well-being? And you could connect that to other topics that you're covering in terms of childhood development. IO psychology, industrial organizational psychology. Here's a question you might explore. What are the effects of gender-based pay inequities on corporate climate? For abnormal psychology, an example of something you can focus on that would increase how you're teaching equitably in psychology could be, how does social class shape access to psychological and psychiatric services? Let's take learning and cognitive psychology. How can principles of operant and classical conditioning be used to change attitudes toward members of ostracized groups? And what about biopsychology? So this is more of a historical perspective within biopsychology, but you can connect it to some of the content that you're trying to reinforce. Why were lobotomies performed disproportionately on women? How did that set things up in the field of biopsychology, and how research was conducted, what research was conducted, and what we know today? And then finally, in personality, a question you might explore in teaching, for example, the Big Five theory of personality. Are the Big Five personality dimensions universal, given the role of gender and culture in identity formation? So again, I just wanted to try to give some explicit examples of what that would look like to try to have a social justice perspective in thinking about course content and curricula. And we're going to get to some examples in terms of how to incorporate experiential learning in your courses as well. So this is related to service learning, but more broadly and generally, I wanted to talk about pedagogy and experiential learning that empowers students. So integrating psychology and experiential learning that empowers students could really help, again, reinforce actual content and academic knowledge. So the goal is to use community experiences to augment in-class learning and to really help students see how they can use their in-class learning proactively in their communities. You can have students draw on prior out-of-class or in-class community experiences to increase student understanding. So students bring with them a very rich background and current experience that can be that can be encouraged. You can encourage them to consider those as examples of the content that you're teaching, and you really have to intentionally ask them about this. You can have intentional projects and activities, so create campus-based or community-based action-oriented assignments that promote social justice. And that would not only be utilizing social justice sort of strategy of more experiential, active, participatory learning, that kind of style of learning, but it also promotes social justice in the students' communities themselves or in the campus community. So coming back to some different kinds of, some different areas of psychology and courses we could think about. Some examples might be for a Psychology of Women course. Students in a Psychology of Women course can organize a Take Back the Night demonstration on campus. And it's not only the sort of goal of organizing the demonstration, but within that, the process of learning about some women's history and women's issues, specifically around violence towards women, could be easily integrated into that process of organizing the demonstration. For developmental psychology, child development students can lobby university officials for the creation of a subsidized on-campus childcare center for children of students and employees. So this would certainly serve a vital function of maybe providing some childcare on campus for, again, for students and employees. But there might be opportunities within that process of learning about some different concepts and the importance of early childhood development, different teaching and caregiving practices. Social psychology students can create a new campus organization to promote interfaith and interracial dialogue and invite community leaders to catalyze discussions. In industrial organizational psychology, students can organize a protest of a megastore that engages in unfair labor practices and gender bias in its hiring and pay. And in so doing, you can help students understand issues around labor practices and gender or other inequities. And then finally, in research methods, students can conduct a campus-wide survey of attitudes toward LGBTQ students, for example, and then learn some analytical methods and strategies as they look at the data that they collect, and then present their analyses to university officials to support programming that promotes tolerance and inclusiveness. So again, just a few examples. At this point, I would probably try to hear from some folks who are watching this now and want to hear your own ideas. Again, not only just to sort of have you think about this for yourself, but in the spirit of having a social justice approach. There are probably a lot of things that there's no way I could think of that you would probably help inform in this kind of presentation and help others learn along with you and me. So that's a good example of what I mean by making courses and teaching more experiential, more participative, more collaborative, and more active. It can really change the way students understand issues and concepts and the way they can personalize them than just listening to a lecture. So on that note, social justice is also promoted, and one can consider how to teach equitably by how you teach, not just what you teach and what kinds of activities you integrate. Instructors who are concerned with social justice often question conventional notions of authority in college classrooms, and really change the relationship between instructor or professor and student, because it may parallel or reinforce how power is exercised more broadly in society. So, for example, Paulo Freire, he is a strong proponent of and created an area of psychology called liberation psychology. And he criticized the, quote, banking model of instruction in which professors maximize their control by exclusively determining course content and relying on lectures to transfer information from themselves to their students. And it's that one-way direction that instruction is based on. This approach encourages students, if we take more of an egalitarian approach, a more social justice approach, encourages students to have greater input and control. It also underscores the importance of students' values and priorities, as well as their beliefs in the teaching and learning process itself. So on a practical note, there are a few recommendations that ENDS and Synacor and some of these references and ideas will be available in my PowerPoint slides if you're interested. But some practical recommendations were discussed in this source. The first of which is what they call responsive goal setting. And here, the process is to provide students with a voice in deciding which topics are emphasized within the course. And you take some time at the start of the semester and throughout the semester to have them develop and revise and reconsider over the semester the syllabus itself and the topics being taught. Another recommendation is to try to establish cooperative learning. And I kind of have mentioned this a little bit in the past few minutes. Encourage students to interact with others, especially those who have a different background in terms of race, ethnicity, social class, age, gender, sexual orientation, and other social identities through problem-based learning or laboratory exercises or group activities and projects. And those relationships and those interpersonal and interactive experiences will be part of the learning itself, not just the end goal of the project or the activity. Finally, integrate instructor self-disclosure as appropriate, which I'm a counseling psychology by training. And so this is something that I'm thinking about from day one of my training. And so in the classroom, that's not been too hard to think about how and to what extent and for what purpose, talking about my own experiences, my own identities, where I'm coming from and my perspective, how to do that in a way that enhances learning and facilitates my relationships with my students. And so it could be really effective to integrate your own self-disclosure as appropriate to model openness and to model considering different perspectives, even about something that might seem pretty clear-cut. And this is the research, this is what it says. But that might not be true for people from, every single group or background. And so modeling the curiosity and the critical inquiry of, this is my experience and this is what I learned, but this is what it kind of looks like in my life or has looked like, or here are examples that I know about, could really model that curiosity and that critical thinking. So I'm going to end on this concept of cultural humility, which I'm borrowing from my counseling and psychotherapy work. So broadly speaking, cultural humility involves an individual's recognition of gaps in knowledge about a particular culture, and limitations of understanding others' cultures and experiences. It's impossible to know everything there is to know about certainly everyone, every person, but every group. There's a lot of within group variation. And so even if you might know a lot about how someone identifies and the groups with which they identify, you don't know where they fall in the range of what we know about that community or that group. And so it's really just recognizing and understanding and acknowledging very explicitly that limitation and having an other-oriented interpersonal stance. So what does that mean? Educators should engage in ongoing self-reflection of their personal cultural identities, including critical evaluation of their personal power, privilege, and marginalization. So really it starts with self-awareness and self-knowledge, and understanding that there might be a lot that you're not aware of in yourself even, and that there's an openness to that ongoing self-reflection. Educators engage in lifelong learning related to culture broadly and cultures to which they do not belong specifically, and talk about that and model the importance of that. Educators allow students to determine which identities are salient for themselves. Educators cultivate a classroom in which cultural humility can occur and encourage a fluid developmental approach to understanding culture. And this can be applied to any topic or area of psychology that is being taught. There's no way we're going to learn everything there is to know about this area. And there's probably a lot of perspectives on this area of psychology that we're not aware of, or that I'm not aware of, that I'm not covering, and to really encourage an openness to that reality. Educators develop assignments and course content in the interest of fostering cultural humility among students. So here, what that's one thing that's referring to is back to when I mentioned having as many group or interpersonal experiential opportunities for students to interact with each other, especially with the intention of interacting with someone who's different from themselves and seeing what they learn from that person. It could be within the class, it can be outside of the class, but encouraging that kind of dialogue and interaction. And so, what I'm presenting here are just general recommendations for educators in psychology for incorporating cultural humility in their coursework and in the development of cultural humility in themselves and students. Perhaps we can call this social justice humility. And I like that because if we're trying to think about teaching, our teaching practice and pedagogy, that feels more of an active kind of process. And so when I think about social justice and how it's different from having, a sensitivity towards culture or being multicultural and celebrating diversity, that is also an important, very important part of our process of teaching. But social justice has an added component of being more active in what you're working towards in your teaching, in the communities you're part of, in the communities that your students are part of, and in the world. And so having some social justice humility in your teaching could be a very broad way of thinking about how you're teaching equitably in psychology. Thank you very much.
That was great. Thank you. Thank you for that, that presentation. And I saw some of the, a couple of questions from the Q&A that you had already addressed. And then just to touch on that, some folks were asking about applications and especially for psych stats, right? Like how do you apply social justice concepts to psych stats? And then I see a comment here from TL Brink, and I think we can, discuss this, that they expose students to research on inequities in law enforcement and healthcare. So I'm already thinking BLM, I'm already thinking COVID-19, like what is the impact on mental health, especially on specific communities? I'm wondering if you can speak about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I mentioned current events somewhere in that presentation, and there's, endless sadly, but also importantly, there's endless
Mhm.
current events and things happening all over our world. Certainly here in our own country and society, that you can probably find examples of whatever content you're teaching. I know it varies and can vary quite significantly across different areas in psychology, but is there a way you can teach that concept by seeing how it's playing out in some real world um, situation that's happening? And if we're talking about the importance of equity and diversion and diversity and inclusion, um, you're very intentional about what which events we're talking about, or groups or situations or circumstances. So you mentioned the BLM movement, um, you know, uh, related to that question about stats classes. I mean, um, if you dig deep, you could probably find a lot of um, research that has been happening over the past decade or so looks at rates and statistics and
Yeah.
probabilities, and lots of hard numbers that you could probably use to teach certain statistical concepts. And at the same time, you're bringing into the discussion what's happening and what's been happening, and how um, you know how this has been evolving over time, and the numbers that we're seeing
Yeah.
go up or go down, and what that means. So that's a great example of that.
Yeah, and I'm curious too, like, I mean, what about labor, right? Especially like unemployment. I mean,
Mhm.
I'm thinking of unemployment and housing because those are two things that are really, as far as
Yeah,
numbers go, especially during this
yeah,
pandemic.
yeah, and just like trying to understand issues around, I mean, in equity and inequity. I mean, there's so many
Yeah.
gaps, right? There's wealth gaps, um, there's wage gaps, there's educational gaps. I mean, you can probably uh, use that sort of those real world dynamics to understand, again, some of these just very intellectual academic concepts, right? They play out in our world. Um, and yeah, I think those are two excellent examples as well. And there were some folks who did add their own examples, which I thought was great in the chat. So I
Yes.
appreciate that. And I hope folks are reading that, because, like I said in my presentation, it's impossible for me to, I just sort of try to think of and gather some very specific examples to make this a little more real. But they're endless. And I think a lot of people have a lot to offer.
Awesome. Well, with that, thank you so much. It looks like we're out of time and we're going to go
Thank
ahead to
you.
our next session. So thank you, Dr. Gallor, for that wonderful presentation and highly informative presentation. So thank you.
Thank you.